Hey there, I'm your imaginary friend, and today I have for you another story by Guy de Maupassant. Now, as always, try to bear in mind that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that at the time of writing to them seemed fine. It's not always fine. This is called On the River. Last summer, I rented a little cottage on the banks of the Seine, a good few miles from Paris, and every night I used to go out there to sleep. After a few days, I got to know one of my neighbors, a man between 30 and 40 years of age, who really was one of the most curious characters I've ever met. He was an old boating enthusiast, absolutely mad about boats, always near the water, or on it, or in it. He must have been born in a boat, and he will certainly die one day while taking his final trip on the river. One evening, when we were walking along the banks of the Seine, I asked him to tell me something of his boating experiences. The old oarsman immediately came to life and his face lit up. He became eloquent, almost poetic. There was one great, all consuming, irresistible passion in his life, his passion for the river. Ah, he said, how many memories I have of this river you see flowing past us. You folk who live in the city streets have no idea what the river really is. But just notice the way a fisherman says the word. For him, it is a thing mysterious, profound, strange. A world of mirage and fantastic shapes. A world in which you can see at night things which are not really there. Hear noises you cannot account for. Shiver for no particular reason, as if you were passing through a graveyard. And you know, the river is the most sinister of all graveyards, because you can be buried here without a grave. To a fisherman, the dry land seems restricted, and in the twilight, when there is no moon, the river seems to be limitless. A sailor doesn't have the same kind of feeling about the sea. It's true that the open sea is often harsh and cruel, but it roars and howls, and you can tell exactly what it is going to do. The river is silent and treacherous. It does not roar. It flows along in continual silence, and this eternal movement of flowing water is more terrifying to me than the great waves of the ocean. Romantic dreamers have claimed that the sea conceals in its depths immense worlds of blue, where those who have been drowned float about amongst the great fish in strange forests and crystal caves. The river has only black depths where the drowned rot in the mud. Yet the river is beautiful when it is glittering in the light of the rising sun and when its waters are gently lapping between banks clothed in rustling reeds. The poet talks about the mournful tales that could be told by the waves of the ocean. Well, I think that the stories whispered by the slender reeds in their tiny, soft voices must be even more sinister than those mournful tales told by the howling waves. But since you asked me to tell you a few of my experiences on the river, I'll tell you about a peculiar thing that happened to me here about 10 years ago. In those days, I lived, and I still do, at Mother Lafon's place. And one of my best friends, Louis Bernet, who incidentally has now given up boating in his easygoing ways to become a counselor, had taken a cottage in a village about 5 miles down the river. We used to have dinner together every day, sometimes at his place, sometimes at mine. One evening I was coming back on my own, feeling rather tired, and with some difficulty rowing my heavy boat, a 12-foot Océan, which I always use at night time. I stopped for a few moments to get my breath back, just over there, near that little promontory formed by the reeds, about 200 yards before you get to the railway bridge. The weather was magnificent. The moon was shining brightly. The surface of the river was gleaming in the moonlight. The air was still and mild. This peaceful atmosphere tempted me. I thought to myself that it would be very pleasant to stop here and smoke a pipe of tobacco. Without any hesitation, I picked up my anchor and threw it overboard. The boat, which was being pulled back downstream by the current, slipped to the end of the chain and stopped, and I sat down in the stern of the boat on my sheepskin rug, making myself as comfortable as possible. There was not a sound to be heard, not a sound, except that occasionally I thought I'd just caught an almost inaudible lapping of water against the river bank, and I could see clumps of reeds rising high above the bank, taking on strange shapes and apparently stirring every now and again. The river was absolutely calm. And yet I felt disturbed by the extraordinary silence which surrounded me. Even the frogs and toads, creatures who normally make music in the swamps at night, were not making a sound. Then, suddenly, somewhere to my right, a frog croaked. The noise made me jump. It didn't croak again. I could hear nothing else, and so I decided to smoke a little just to give myself something to do. But though I'm an inveterate pipe smoker, I couldn't do it. After a puff or two, I felt sick and stopped smoking. I started to hum a tune, but the sound of my voice somehow disturbed me. And so I lay down in the bottom of the boat and looked up at the sky. For a while I felt calm, but soon I became worried by the slight pitching of the boat. The impression I had was that it was lurching violently, touching first one bank and then swinging over to the other. Then I got the idea that some invisible being or force was gently drawing the boat to the bottom of the river and lifting it up and letting it drop again. I fancied I was being tossed about as if in the middle of a storm, and I could hear noises all around me. I leapt to my feet. The water was gleaming in the moonlight, and everything was calm. I realized that what was the matter was that my nerves were a bit on edge, and I decided it was time to move on. I pulled on my anchor chain. The boat started to move, and then I felt a resistance. I pulled harder, but the anchor wouldn't budge. It had caught on something at the bottom of the river, and I simply couldn't get it up. I started tugging again, but it was no use. Then, by using the oars, I turned my boat round and moved upstream a little in order to change the position of the anchor. It was no good. It held as firm as ever. I lost my temper and gave the chain a furious shaking, but it still wouldn't budge. Very discouraged, I sat down and began to think about the mess I was in. I couldn't dream of breaking this chain or separating it from the boat. It was enormously thick and riveted to the bows in a piece of wood that was thicker than my arm. But as the weather was still very good, I thought it would probably not be long before some fisherman would come to my rescue. This annoying discovery had calmed my nerves. I sat down and found that at last I could smoke my pipe. I had a bottle of rum with me. I drank 2 or 3 glasses and began to laugh at the situation I was in. The weather was really very mild, so at a pinch I could spend the night in the open without coming to much harm. Suddenly there was the sound of a bump against the side of my boat. I jumped to my feet with a start, and a cold sweat broke out all over my body. The sound had no doubt been made by some piece of driftwood carried along by the current, but it had been sufficient to upset me. And once again I felt myself in the grip of a strange nervousness. I grabbed hold of the anchor chain and pulled on it for all I was worth in one final desperate effort. The anchor held firm. I sat down once again, exhausted. Meanwhile, the river had gradually become covered with very dense white mist, which crept along close to the surface of the water, with the result that when I stood up, I could no longer see either the river or my feet or my boat. All I could see were the tips of the reeds, then, farther away, the meadows, all pale in the moonlight, with large black patches reaching up into the sky, which were formed by groups of Lombardy poplars. It was just as though I was buried up to my waist in an expanse of incredibly white cotton wool, and it conjured up all kinds of fantasies. I imagined that somebody was trying to get into the boat. which I could no longer see beneath me, and that the river, concealed by his opaque fog, must be full of strange creatures which were swimming all around me. I experienced a horrible feeling of faintness. My temples were throbbing. My heart was pounding so hard I seemed to be short of breath. And losing all self control, I seriously thought of jumping overboard and swimming to safety. And immediately this idea made me shudder with fright. I pictured myself lost, floundering about haphazardly in this thick mist, struggling amongst the vegetation and reeds which I would surely become entangled in, gasping in terror, unable to see the bank, unable to find my boat. And I seemed to feel myself being dragged by my feet down into the depths of that murky water. In fact, as I would have had to swim against the current for at least 500 yards before finding a part free of waterweed and rushes where I could get a proper foothold, I had a 90% chance of losing my way in the fog and of getting drowned, no matter how good a swimmer I might be. I tried to reason with myself. I felt absolutely determined not to be afraid, but there was something within me other than my willpower, and that something else was experiencing fear. I asked myself what there was to be afraid of. The brave part of me jeered at the cowardly part, and never have I felt as strongly as I did on that occasion the struggle between the two beings which live within us, one willing something, the other resisting it, and each triumphing over the other in turn. This stupid and unaccountable fear was still increasing and was now becoming sheer terror. I stood there motionless, with my eyes open wide and my ears straining to catch any possible sound, waiting. What was I waiting for? I had no idea. But whatever it was, it must have been terrible. I think that if a fish had suddenly taken it into its head to jump out of the water, as fish frequently do, that would have been quite sufficient to make me fall flat on my face unconscious. However, by making a strenuous effort to control myself, I finally managed to bring my state of mind gradually back to normal. Once again, I took my bottle of rum and drank from it in great gulps. Then I had an idea. I started to call out at the top of my voice, successively turning to face the 4 points of the compass. When my throat hurt so much that I couldn't shout any more, I stood and listened. All I could hear was the distant howling of a dog. I drank some more rum. Then I lay down, stretching myself full length along the bottom of the boat. I stayed like this for maybe an hour, possibly 2 hours, without going to sleep, with my eyes wide open and with nightmares hovering all around me. I didn't dare sit up, and yet I had an intense desire to do so. Each minute I kept putting it off, saying to myself, "Come on, sit up." But I was too afraid to move. At long last I slowly began to raise myself, taking infinite care as I did so, as if my very life depended on the slightest sound I might make. And I looked over the side of the boat. My eyes were dazzled by the most marvelous, the most astonishing sight it is possible to imagine. It was just like one of those phantasmagoric tableaux depicting fairyland, one of those fantastic scenes that travelers from distant countries describe to us, and we listen without really believing them. The fog, which 2 hours before had been hanging over the water, had gradually lifted and settled over the banks. Leaving the river entirely clear, it had formed on each side a long, continuous hill, 6 or 7 yards high, which shone in the moonlight with a superb brilliance of snow. The result was that nothing could be seen except this fire-spangled river flowing between these two white mountains, and overhead a full, brilliant moon set in a sky of milky blue. All the inhabitants of the riverbank had come to life. The frogs were croaking away furiously, and every now and then, sometimes on my left, sometimes on my right, I could hear the short, slow, dismal note of a metallic-voiced toad serenading the stars. Oddly enough, I was no longer afraid. I was surrounded by such extraordinary scenery that the most bizarre phenomena would not have surprised me in the least. Just how long all this lasted, I have no idea, because eventually I dropped off to sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the moon had gone down, and the sky was full of clouds. The water was lapping mournfully against the boat. The wind was blowing. It was cold and pitch dark. I drank what was left of the rum. And then, as I sat there shivering, I listened to the rustling of reeds and the sinister murmur of the river. I tried to see, but I could make out neither my boat nor even my hands when I held them close to my eyes. Gradually, however, the intense darkness diminished. Suddenly, I thought I sensed a dark shape gliding along, quite near to me. I gave a shout, and a voice answered me. It was a fisherman. I called across to him, and he rowed up to me. I told him all about my misadventure. And then he brought his boat alongside mine, and together we pulled on my anchor chain. The anchor still would not budge. The day was dawning, a gloomy, gray, wet, chilly day. One of those days which you feel is bound to bring you sorrow and misfortune. I caught sight of another boat, and we shouted across to it. The man who was in it rowed up and added his efforts to our own, and finally, little by little, the anchor began to move. It came up very, very slowly and was obviously carrying a considerable weight. At last we saw a black mass emerge, and we dragged it into my boat. It was the corpse of an old woman with a huge stone tied round her neck.